Cool. Today, we are very happy to have Stephanie Schmitt-Grohe to present a paper. Stephanie is a professor at Columbia University, a member research associate at MBER. Stephanie has made so many groundbreaking and influential work in the literature. I think everyone in international macro at some point must have cited the Schmitt-Grohe-Uribe 2003 paper. And of course, they have many other papers as well, including the downward rigidity recent work on many of recent work are related to, I would say, transitory and permanent analysis of tariff shocks, of interest rate differential, etc. And we are also very happy to have Daniel Ostry to present to discuss the paper. Daniel is a very promising junior that work on many different stuff. So Daniel has worked on convenience yield, has worked on exchange rate risk, and also has worked on FX derivative market. It's an amazing data set on knowing everything about the UK. So without further ado, let me pass the mic to Stephanie, and then Daniel will have a discussion at the end. Thank you.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining and thanks a lot for giving us the opportunity to present this paper. So this is joint work with Martin Uribe, and it is an empirical paper about the effects of import tariff shocks in the United States. So when we started working on this paper, we looked what empirical papers on tariffs existed, and we were surprised that from a macroeconomic point of view, namely asking what are the effects on macroeconomic aggregates, there is not that much work. So we decided to work on it ourselves. And our starting point is that from theory, one of the things we know that it makes a difference whether the import tariff shock is transitory or permanent. So we know, for example, one of the motivations that is often given for imposing import tariffs are concerns about the trade balance. So some people argue we should, or at least in policy circles, it's argued imposing import tariffs will solve chronic trade deficit problem. So what do we know from theory? We know that transitory tariff increases reduce current demand because there's an intertemporal substitution. So you don't want to absorb that much domestically right now. And once the tariff is gone, you do. And so in that sense, they should improve the external accounts. You should have a trade balance improvement in response to a transitory tariff shock. But if the tariff increases of a more permanent nature, then this intertemporal substitution doesn't play a role, is gone. And so the expectation should be that in the data, a permanent tariff increase will have less of an effect on the external account. So it will not be particularly helpful in reducing, at least temporarily or even permanently, the trade balance deficit. So motivated by this observation, we estimate the impact of import tariffs using an empirical model that can explicitly distinguish between transitory and permanent tariff shocks. So what we were setting out to answer are the following questions. Are tariff increases inflationary? So why do I list that as the first question? Because when we looked at the existing empirical literature on the macroeconomic effects of import tariff increases. Besides that literature being thin, one paper that we think is rather related by Burr and Reed, they use for the identification assumption of the import tariff rate that the import tariff increase must be inflationary. So then we cannot really answer that question, are import tariff increases inflationary? What do we find? Just to give a heads up, we find no evidence of transitory tariff increases to be inflationary. It is also generally believed that, or often the conventional view is that import tariff increases could be contractionary. We don't find much evidence in support of that. Are they effective in improving the external accounts? So here we find some evidence consistent with the intertemporal approach to the current account, namely that transitory import tariff increases improve the trade balance, whereas permanent ones leave them largely unchanged. Another idea that people have about import tariffs is that they affect competitiveness. So from a more trade perspective, people would say if you have an increase in the import tariff rate, that should increase domestic prices. So that should make the domestic economy more expensive relative to the foreign economy. So that should, in that sense, reduce competitiveness. It makes the domestic increase competitiveness by making the domestic country more expensive. So we look at that and we don't find much evidence for that either. And our last question is, what is the Fed doing when there's an import tariff increase? Why are we interested in that question? Currently, until recently at least, much of the debate on whether the Fed should tighten or when it should ease and how long it should wait until it eases next time was shaped in part by the concern that the Trump 2 import tariff increases may be inflationary. And so if we have that as one shock going into that, maybe that is a reason not yet to normalize interest rates. So that's a motivation why we look at that. So what are our main findings of our empirical framework? So transitory tariff increases are neither inflationary nor contractionary, and they are usually not associated with a monetary tightening. Instead, what we think we are getting, or what would be consistent with it, is a story of transitory tariff increases having a very large negative effect on aggregate demand, and thus they are not inflationary. And also that the Fed actually eases, but maybe not enough to catch the fall in aggregate demand. On the other hand, if we have permanent tariff increases, they tend to trigger a one-off increase in the price level, relatively small, but some significant increase in the price level, and a brief tightening episodes, and not much effect on real quantities, such as output. But for the open economy side, at least theory shines through in the sense that we have that transitory tariff increases reduce imports and improve the trade balance, whereas permanent increases don't change the trade balance much. I think I said it wrong. For imports, obviously, an increase in import tariffs should reduce imports. And overall, what we find is that from a business cycle perspective, tariff shocks are not that important. They are minor drivers of the US business cycle on average. And as hopefully I'll have time to show, even during episodes of substantial tariff hikes, such as Nixon 1971, Ford 1975, and Trump 2018, they didn't play a major role. So just since this will come up a couple of times, Nixon 1971 was an episode that in August 1971, Nixon pretty much surprised the markets by announcing an across-the-board 10% surcharge, so a 10% increase in ad valorem tariffs, and then by December 1971, he revoked them. So this was based on, economic record, a transitory shock. Ford 1975 did something that's more like a specific tariff. He put a $2 per barrel of oil import tariff on oil imports. And as you'll see in a moment in the data, that ended up being quite a large increase in tariffs for the United States. And that was also temporary. It lasted about 1 year. There were some ups and downs in 75, but by the end of 1975, it was gone. And then Trump won, which is Trump 2018. He put about 15% tariffs, not across the board and not across all countries. These were some specific goods that were tariffed, and also by country, it was more on China than on others. And this tariff ended up being rather permanent. So in the sense that the Biden administration did not remove those tariffs. Okay, let me say something briefly about the related literature. So on the macro side, there's this Burr and Reed paper that is related to ours. And there's also a really nice paper by Baratieri, Cacciatore, and Gironi. They have a great identification for what we would call anticipated retaliatory tariffs, because they look at anti-dumping complaint filings in Canada. And so when you initiate an anti-dumping complaint, you might be granted an anti-dumping tariff. So they have this. What is different in our studies relative to those is that they tend not to distinguish between transitory and permanent tariff shocks. And as I said, the Burr and Reed paper uses actually the assumption that tariff increases are inflationary as an identification assumption. There are many, many, many micro studies on tariffs, so they're not macro, and they typically find an almost one-to-one pass-through of the import tariff rate on the goods price. The Amiti, Gomez, and Weinstein paper has a little touch of macro in it, in the sense they study the Trump 1 tariffs, and they have an event study of 19 events of how China retaliated and Trump changed the tariffs in the 2018 episode, and they can show that tariff increases using stock market data and yield data. They show that those tariff increases in these episodes reduced measures of pretty long run expected inflation, like 1, 2, 3, 4 years out. So that's also. In terms of, there's a huge body of work on the theoretical implications. And so I guess since this is an empirical paper, I'm not going to mention that much. And then what econometric methodology do we use to be able to identify transitory and permanent tariff shocks? And also, as you'll see, I will later mention that we now also include anticipation. So our framework can allow for anticipated tariff changes, and that follows the econometric methodology introduced in a paper by Uribe, single-authored paper by Uribe in 2022.
Okay. Can I ask a quick question here on the literature? There's a recent paper, I mean, after this paper by Regis at San Francisco Fed. And
yes.
The reason I mention it is kind of like a lousy paper, because I see many news articles, they are saying, oh, the Fed is saying that tariff that doesn't increase inflation, or but I think it's kind of along the same line, right? Because tariff doesn't increase inflation. It is because at the background, the Fed react to that, and also like a demand reduction associated with the tariff increase, right?
Yes, I mean that's also an empirical paper,
yes.
And they use data, very long annual time series, and they have, I think, since the late 1900s.
Century,
yeah. So 18 something they start, and so they do find, consistent with our study, they do find that tariff increases are not inflationary.
Right.
So that is, I think, the common result across those two papers.
I see. So you think the two papers largely agree in terms of finding, and also the underlying story of why tariff is not inflationary.
Yes, I mean, they have a different identification scheme. Right. So, for example, we actually started this paper as a paper of annual data since 1876, and we couldn't find that significant responses. And that is why we then moved to quarterly data, but we might revisit that. But I think the general message that is very difficult to find in the data evidence that import tariff increases, at least in US data and inflationary, I think that is joined between these two papers.
I see. Yeah, great. Thank you.
Okay, so the first problem that is faced by a macroeconomist when wanting to write about the effect of import tariff rates is you need to come up with a measure of the import tariff rate. And in reality, there are thousands and thousands of import tariff rates because there are thousands and thousands of goods. And then moreover, it's not even that the tariff schedule has the same import tariff rate for a good for all countries. So there are two dimensions, so number of goods and also number of countries. So you need to do something to get an aggregate measure. And what is the simplest aggregate measure to use for which we have data? So we're going to look at three measures here in this paper. So the first one is the most commonly used, that you just say, okay, I know from NEPA accounts I have D, duties collected, and from NEPA accounts I have the M, the value of goods imports. So this is the value of goods imports net of tariffs. So you can say one simple measure would be to just take the ratio of duties to imports. What is great about this is easy to compute. You can get a long quarterly time series since 1959 Q1 from NEPA in the case of the US, or if you were to do annual data, you can actually go back to 1870 or something. So let me explain two things. Why is this called a trade-weighted import tariff rate? And then why are concerns that this measure of the tariff rate suffers from a composition bias that might lead you to interpret something as a tariff shock, which really isn't one. So let's first see why this is called the trade-weighted import tariff rate. So if we start with the definition of the tariff rate as being duties divided by imports, then duties is the sum of duties collected across all goods I divided by the sum of all the value of all imports of goods. And so you can rewrite that as if duties is the ad valorem tariff rate times the value of imports. So you can express duties in this way, and then you can rearrange this as the weight. So where the weight would be the value of imports of good I divided by the value of total imports of goods, and that is called the share, SIT. So from this formula, you first see that if you just do aggregate duties divided by aggregate imports, you get a import-weighted or trade-weighted average of actual tariff rates. So what's the concern with the composition bias? The concern with the composition bias is if you use this as your measure of tariffs, and suppose tariff of a specific good I goes up by a lot, and in response consumers choose to substitute away from this particular good, so that would mean that this share here would fall, and therefore you would have an attenuation effect. You wouldn't really capture that tau t moves as much as it really does. So the question is this a big problem? So when people use, this is the most commonly used measure, and typically when you start with this measure, somebody will raise their hand and say, oh, this is, a pretty poor measure of tariffs because of this attenuation or composition bias effect. So because of that, we ask, is this really a problem? Well, if you're mainly concerned with composition bias, then you would like to use a fixed weight, right? You would like to use, instead of SIT, you would like to use a fixed weight. But that complicates things a lot, because that would require that instead of having only aggregate data on duties and imports, you would need to know something at the disaggregate level. We can do something about this. We can construct a fixed weight index because we do have disaggregate data, at least since 1990, from the U.S. International Trade Commission. So there is data at which disaggregation level at the harmonized tariff schedule 6-digit level. So let me tell you how disaggregated this is. These are some examples. So if you look at the second row, for example, what is one 6-digit level is spices, pepper of the genus Piper, neither crushed nor ground. That gives you one example of how disaggregated it is. But you can, I didn't know what mangosteens are, so I had to learn, but this is very specific. Mangosteens, mangoes, guavas, fresh or dried. So it is not the is pretty disaggregated. That's all I want to say. So from the USITC, you can get data on duties at this disaggregation level. And then you get imports of goods at this disaggregation level. And so you can also use duties divided by imports, and you get a good-specific tariff rate. Is this perfect? In my opinion, it's a big advantage, big move forward instead of just using one aggregate. Here we end up using 4,025 goods. But of course, you can also say, well, this is not country specific. I could do something finer. But I think going from just one number of having 4,025 numbers is progress. So this controls for composition bias. The disadvantage is we could not find, we looked a little bit around, all we could find was data that allowed us to construct this time series since 1990 Q1, and we have posted those time series on our website if other people would like to use this. So that's our fixed, that is our fixed rate tariff series, and it uses a fixed weight, namely the share in the year 2006, which lies sort of is a low tariff period, and also lies in the middle of our sample. And our third series is something that is maybe has more economic theory background. So the trade people, they have thought about this question: if you have a full tariff schedule, is there a way to express that complicated tariff schedule as a single welfare-based measure of a uniform tariff? And the people who introduced this concept are Anderson and Neary, and the person who gives an approximation that is an approximation, but is at least implementable from a practical point of view without having a good like a model specific computation and having to solve a GE model, is Feenstra. So Feenstra has this concept that's also trying to get at the uniform tariff, which in a given period delivers the same level of welfare as the actual tariff schedule. And you can think about that a little bit about the consumer surplus under a demand curve. It's a quadratic approximation. And from a practical point of view, you need to know tariffs at the good level at I, the shares, we already had them, but you also need elasticities, namely price elasticity of demand for these import goods. And so there's a team at the World Bank, and he is at the World Bank, and others, they have computed those import elasticities. If we force to have a balanced panel and we want to have import elasticities, our sample shrinks from 4,025 6-digit level goods to just 2,761. We have this again since 1990. And the pros are that at least this measure of the aggregate tariff has a uniform tariff interpretation, like what would be matched in our macro models the closest. So if you compare those three, these are the time series. So what do you see? Let's first look at the most simple one, the blue line, for which we have the longest data. Do we see the Nixon shock? Yes, we see clearly the Nixon shock. Tariffs reached almost 9%. Do we see the Ford shock? Yes. Does it look temporary under this measure? Yes. The narrative is also consistent that this is temporary. And also, let me just say, in case somebody in this audience is interested in the issue of ad valorem versus specific tariffs, the Ford shock was a specific tariff, was during a period of high inflation, and nevertheless the measure shows it as a very clear spike. Okay, meaning high inflation didn't erode the nominal specific tariff, right? So it clearly shows it and didn't blunt it. And then we have Trump here. Trump won, and Trump won was a tariff increase about 2-3 percentage points, and it was rather permanent. Okay. The general thing is tariffs have been falling until Trump took office in 2018. Our paper ends in 2024 Q4. If you want to know, we are now updating it to go longer, but you might think these are small numbers. Just to put this into context, this measure, even if you go until 2025 Q3, you cannot reach more than 12% as the average. It's not like crazily out there. So now what about the two other tariff rates that we construct to see whether our simple measure is okay? So if you look at the magenta line, which is the one with the fixed weight tariff index, and you can see, first of all, those two series move very closely. Magenta and blue, the correlation is 0.97. And what you know for the trade restrictiveness index is, yes, it has a big level effect, but the correlation, I think, is 0.95 with the blue line. The fact that the TRI is very closely related to the trade weighted index, that is to say, red line versus blue line, is in the literature. That was in the key K&O paper, and also Douglas Irving has papers on that, on historical tariff rates since the 1800s. He has a more coarse disaggregation than we do, say, in the magenta line. He has only 17 categories of goods, but he also shows there's a level effect, a level difference, and there's a very high correlation. And the K&O team also has emphasized this. So here, what is our contribution is just to construct them at a quarterly frequency. Usually people who work with these two other indices are, the TRI is a cross country at one point in time. So what do we do once we see this picture? We say, okay, this seems that those tariff sequences are not very different, and we have a big trade-off to make here. In particular, we want to identify permanent tariff shocks. So what do? Do we throw 30 years of data away for avoiding a composition bias, or do we go ahead and use the blue line, which is a much longer sample, and based on this figure, we think this is a pretty good approximation. So how the paper proceeds, we go with the blue line. The advantage is we have much longer data, and then I don't show you these results, but we re-estimated the model, including the red line or the pink line and the blue line, and use missing observations, treat the earlier observations of those as missing observations, and our results are robust to that. So that's the reason why we proceed with using the trade-weighted import tariff rate. What is our econometric model? Okay, so sometimes we have discussants and they say we run an SVR. So I just want to be very clear. This is not an SVR. Okay, so maybe you think it's an SVR. So what are the challenges here? We need to identify a tariff shock, and we need to be able to separate transitory from permanent tariffs. So that's what we want to do. So we use this method introduced by Martin to use something that looks like an empirical version of a DSGE model, right? And so this, if you are used to solving DSGE models, this will look very familiar to you. So we're going to have a state space model. We're going to say for most of the time we see 6 variables: the change in the import tariff rate. I spent now time explaining what that is. The change in GDP, the change in import to output ratio, the trade balance to output ratio, the change in the federal funds rate, and then something we call the interest rate inflation differential. The framework we have has one advantage, or one of the advantages it has over VARs, is that we can have many more shocks than observables. So here we have 10 shocks competing to explain 6 variables, and when we have anticipated shocks, which I will not show today, I just tell you that our results are robust to that, we will have up to like 16 shocks competing for these 6 observables. And of these 10 shocks we have today, or I show you today, 6 are transitory, and the key one of the transitory ones I'm interested in is what we call the transitory tariff shock Z-tau, and we have 4 permanent shocks. And, a monetary permanent shock, like a technology shock, permanent shock to output, and a permanent shock to the external accounts to explain the drift in the trade balance. But the one that we are mainly interested in is the permanent tariff shock X tau T. So this paper is about how to identify Z tau T, the transitory tariff shock, and X tau T. So what are we going to say? If you read what trade people discuss, is typically that the tariff is not driven by business cycle considerations. The tariff tends to be driven by political events. So in that sense, tariffs seem to be exogenous. And also Douglas Irving has a discussion of what moves tariffs, and he says the desire to raise revenue, political considerations, but it's not really driven by business cycles. So we're gonna make an assumption that Z tau is the only shock that is able to change the tariff on impact. And within that assumption, we will have two cases. One case is to say that the tariff rate can respond to other variables with one leg. That's what we call endogenous tariffs. And we have one case in which the tariff rate, and that's all what I'm going to show you because our results are robust to that, and it's simpler to show, is that actually there's no feedback from the economy to the level of the tariff. And for the permanent tariff shock, the identification is simpler. That's just to say what is the variable, the level of the tariff is co-integrated. Remember here you can already see the tariff has this sort of U shape and is declining and then comes up. The permanent component basically has to run through the middle of that blue line. That's the identification of the permanent component. So this is our model. This is a completely latent state variable model. So let me just mention what we define. We define a hat means something is a cyclical component. So the cyclical component of the tariff is the actual tariff, which I described to you how we measure it, minus its permanent component. And output has a cyclical component. Import to output ratio has a cyclical component. We allow for the trade balance to output ratio to have a cyclical component because we don't necessarily want to assume that exports and imports share the exact same cyclical component. When we estimate a non-zero value for this alpha, we assume that the normal interest rate has a permanent component and that inflation has the same permanent component as the Fed funds rate, which is, in words, we are assuming that the Fisher effect holds in the long run. That's what we are imposing here. Okay, so then these 6 latent cyclical components, yes, they are written like a little bit like a SVR. So yes, there are 2 legs here, but they also depend on our 10 shocks, 6 transitory shocks and 4 permanent. And again, we are interested in the first element and in the 7th element. In particular, we are interested in the values here in the first column, because what does that tell you? For example, C21 tells you what happens if you have an innovation in Z tau, the transitory shock, what happens to output. Or Z61 tells you if you have a transitory shock to the tariff, to inflation. Why do we write this like a Koleski? Because this first block is with all the transitory shocks. We don't care to identify in an economic sense any of the other transitory shocks. So we can just write it as a Koleski because we don't care about that. And then the permanent shocks are identified from, in each case, to find the trend component. But again, our main interest here is what are the values of the 7th column, because it tells you what happens on impact to these cyclical components. So this paper is about estimating C2, C3, C4, C5, C6. What does it mean? Maybe you are looking at this and you see the 0 here and you say, wait a second, the tariff rate has a 0 coefficient on the permanent component, on delta X tau. What does that mean? Does it mean it doesn't affect the tariff? Well, it means that it doesn't affect the cyclical component of the tariff. But what does it so that means if you have a permanent tariff shock, delta X tau is positive, and we are imposing that tau hat T has a 0 response, that means that the tariff moves 1-for-1 on impact with a permanent component, right? So that is to say, suppose you permanently increase the tariff rate by 10%, then it means X tau that you do it already on impact. You could have other assumptions here. For example, it's not how we do anticipated shocks because later on we want to have like 8 quarters of anticipation, but you could suppose you put a -1 here in this element in C17 instead of a 0. What that would mean? Well, that would mean that if this is a -1, this would mean that tau hat is -1. That means that the tariff rate doesn't move at all on impact if we had constrained that coefficient instead of 0 to -1. So that would be a purely one period anticipated shock, right? And so that's at least a framework what you can do. Then what do we assume about the exogenous shocks? We assume that they are all independent AR1 processes. So one other feature of this framework is even though we're going to only quote unquote have two lags, because the shocks themselves have an AR structure, there's much more persistent in that framework than just an AR2 structure we're going to have. So in case you were thinking, wait a second, at business cycles, we always have 4 legs. Having 2 legs here and having the fact that this is an AR1 process also gives much more persistence to the model. Okay, so this is all latent. How do you estimate a latent variable state space model? This is a latent state space model. This looks very much like the first order conditions of a linear SDSGE model, but with different parameter restrictions. So how do you estimate a latent state space model? You need to come up with some observables that link data to your latent states. And so the observables we pick is changes in tariff, changes in output, changes in the import to output ratio, changes in the trade balance to output ratio, changes in the federal funds rate, and then the difference between the normal interest rate and inflation. Let me say something about what are my priors for column 1 and column 7. So what would be true under the prior mean? My prior for the coefficients in column 1 and column 7 is a normal 0, 1, 0 with some standard deviation. So under the prior, it is assumed that the tariff doesn't affect output, import to output ratio, trade balance, the Fed funds rate, or inflation. That's true under the prior mean. Sorry, under the prior is under the prior mean. That's true. So we are not baking into here that tariffs are either inflationary or deflationary, which is something I care about. And similar, we are not baking in something about it being expansionary or contractionary. So, and neither do we limit how tariffs, whether they help solve the U.S. chronic trade deficit. So this is what I just said in words, is to say all these C coefficients have a prior that is normal 0.5.
Sorry
Yeah.
for my ignorance. Like the estimation here has to be done by Bayesian method, is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
So
that's
what do,
that's
yeah.
That's because we don't know the latent variable. We have to estimate that.
Yes. So this here is a latent state space model, right?
Yeah.
And then you say, if this is the true driver, can I link some observables to these latent variables? And these are the so-called observation equations. So you say, I do see the left-hand side here. I have a measure of the tariff. So I see the change in the tariff. And then I can relate it to my latent variables, to the cyclical component of the tariff today, the cyclical component of the tariff yesterday, and then the other latent variable, the change in the permanent component of the tariff. And so what you do then is you want to do what's the maximum likelihood of seeing this time series for the 6 left-hand sides since 1951 Q1 to 2024 Q4. What's the what parameters of the model, that is to say, what parameters in the B matrix, the C matrix, the row, this diagonal row matrix and psi matrix, maximize the likelihood of seeing that data. So you do an MCMC chain, you specify the priors, you make an MCMC change. In our case, we do a random sample of first 1 million of a 50 million MCMC chain, and that's what we report the values of. Okay?
Okay,
Steve?
thank you. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, so what do we find? Remember what the background is. The policymakers who are putting in the current import tariff are saying they want to bring down the trade deficit, right? And I guess more indirectly, they're also saying we are going to avoid this massive appreciation that the US has experienced. And so they want the other countries to appreciate their currencies relative to the US. That's sort of the background. And the claim is it will not be inflationary. And no, don't worry, it won't lead to a massive recession. So what do we find? So we first look at something more like Trump 1, namely a permanent tariff shock. But okay, sorry, I forgot. First, we do a general question. Even though tariff shocks have dominated the news lately, from a macroeconomic perspective, as a driver of business cycles, they are really not important. So this is an unconditional variance. These are posterior means from 100,000 draws in this case. And what do you see? The two type of tariff shocks we allow for explain less than 10% of inflation output in the federal funds rate. They explain a little bit more of the external accounts. They explain 9% of the import to GDP ratio and 19% of the trade balance to output ratio. But from a policymaker's perspective, I guess, yes, maybe, well, depend which policy. If you talk to the Council of Economic Advisor or do you talk to the Fed, it should be pretty clear that at least historically, for the United States, in the sample 1959 Q1 to 2024 Q4, variations in tariffs explain only 6% of variations in inflation. So it's a minor driver. 3% of variations in real GDP and 5% of variations in the federal funds rate. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. Tariffs, at least historically, have been a small mover of the business cycle. What about a permanent tariff shock? So here, all our experiments are for a shock that eventually increases the tariff rate by 10 percentage points. So it's almost like a Nixon shock. He had a surcharge of 10% on everything. Of course, the Nixon shock is purely transitory. Here it's permanent. But what I mean, similar to the Nixon shock, I mean in size, 10 percentage points. And you can see we estimate this is very quickly that it goes to 10%. So what happened to inflation? We are showing 90% credible bands. So if you maybe we should be showing the price level. If you accumulate that inflation response, you get an increase in the price level of slightly below 50 basis points. So a 10 percentage point increase in the tariff rate leads to a permanent increase in the price level of about 50 basis points. So it's a very small, but yes, there's a one-off increase in inflation. Is it true? So how to look at the next graph, which is output. So what are we coming from? The conventional view is that tariffs are highly contractionary. So does this impulse response support that claim that they are contractionary? And our interpretation of that graph is there's very little evidence that they are contractionary. If you want to nitpick, you can say yes, on import, the point estimate is negative, and actually the 90% credible band is in the first period below zero, but in general, that impulse response, I think, is very difficult to support the claim that permanent tariff increases are contractionary. So we conclude they are not contractionary. What did the Fed do historically in response to these permanent shocks? They tightened, but just for 2 quarters, and then it's over. What about the intertemporal approach to the current account? Theory would tell you the trade balance shouldn't respond much. We get that the trade balance to output ratio has the 90% credible band always includes zero. So we interpret this as being consistent with the intertemporal approach to the current account. What about transitory tariff shocks? Okay, so first of all, how persistent are the transitory tariff shocks we estimate? We again go for a 10 percentage point impact, and you can see after the half-life is below 1 year. So what type of expectations did we have in our mind when we first looked at this graph? We were expecting to see that inflation goes up. I told you that also some other papers have as an identification assumption of a tariff shock, that one of the things from a sign restriction approach must be that it drives up, this is CPI inflation. And if you looked at our paper, the words we use to describe this graph is to say a 10 percentage points increase in the tariff rate is not inflationary. You might find that slightly euphemistic when you see this. You might say, if I were to describe this graph, I would say it's clearly deflationary. It's tightly estimated and has at an annualized rate a 6% deflation. But why do we use the word they are not inflationary? Because that's the conventional view. Everybody thinks import tariff rate up, imported goods prices go up, therefore CPI inflation has to go up. And we have tried very hard to get rid of this result, and we cannot. And so even, in very different forms, we consistently find that transitory tariff increases are not inflationary. The next graph is real output. With what eyes did we come into looking at this for the first time? Well, we were also thinking, should be true that output falls, and we don't find any evidence for that. So we also say output, that is domestic production, is not contractionary. There are some theories in which output may increase. So this, if we want to, this is not a paper about theory, but very loosely speaking, how could I get inflation to fall if there's a massive demand shock? Would it be possible to have a massive demand shock and nevertheless have to get domestic value added to increase? There would have to be a rapid shift to domestic production and increases in domestic exports, right, to make that consistent. But what the words we use to describe this graph is that transitory tariff increases are not contractionary. That's as far as I want to engage with this graph. I don't want to engage in saying, it increases output by 5%. What has the Fed done historically? They very briefly eased. That would be consistent with the demand story. If you think demand is weak, then you would think, okay, it makes sense for the Federal Reserve to ease in response to the tariff increase. What about the intertemporal approach to the current account? So this is almost a poster boy. This works very nicely. You have a transitory increase in import tariffs, imports fall, and we have a significant decline in imports. And as the textbook would tell you, you have a significant improvement in the trade balance to output ratio. So those politicians who are saying they're putting in the tariff, if they would also modify their claim, we're going to put in the tariff temporarily, then they can obtain the result they are looking for, namely that the trade balance deficit improves. But definitely it is not consistent with our data that the claim that the chronic trade deficit of the US could be made smaller, and that is true for both transitory shocks and also permanent shocks. So this is not a cure for a trade balance deficit, either transitory or permanent import tariff shocks. So let's look a little bit more into whether we can put a demand story to this. I mean, this is not exactly a demand story. Probably wouldn't look at consumption to output ratio, would look at consumption or total domestic absorption entirely. But here we looked at consumption to output ratio and asked the same question as in the previous graph, namely what happens in response to a transitory increase. And we find that the consumption to output ratio falls a little bit. So what interpretation can we attach to that? We can say that at least the output increase is not consumption driven, right? That's what we can say. And what happens to the real interest rate? The real interest rate increases. That would also be consistent or with a dampener of demand. Okay, so I don't know, it's 50 now, how many more seconds I have, and I'm not stealing them from Daniel, so maybe I say one more thing. What about
tell
me
ahead,
how many?
Maybe another 5 minutes.
Okay. So what about competitiveness? So if you look at the political statements that come of the Council of Economic Advisors, there seems to be this idea that, all right, so this is data here, raw data. This is the US real exchange rate. This is the so-called BIS narrow measure. This is the US dollar against 27 countries, trade weighted. Up means the US becomes more expensive. Down means, so appreciation, down means depreciation of the dollar in real terms, means that the US becomes cheaper. So just if you look at that and look at the three big episodes we had, Nixon, Ford, and Trump, there doesn't seem to be a pattern, right? Nixon happened within a generalized depreciation of the dollar in real terms. Around Ford, nothing happened. And here you can maybe even see the political debate right now from the Council of Economic Advisors. One of the motivations for the tariff is to go against the appreciation of the US dollar in real terms that has happened over, the past 10 years. So that story is true. There's just appreciation. Since 2010, there has been a continuous appreciation. Is it true that throwing tariff in the mix has done anything to this trend or has temporarily slowed it? If you look at the Trump line now, there has been no effect. I would say it came a little bit down before, but it's true this is an appreciation trend, and these ones were in a depreciation trend. So then if we do the estimation and ask, does a transitory tariff shock has any response on the real exchange rate, we get error bands that are as wide as the United States. So we get no significant effect on the real exchange rate. And the same is true if we have a permanent tariff shock. So maybe you're more from the trade side and you think a permanent tariff shock is like what happens in a static model. You would think is an appreciation. Yes, I can give you an appreciation as a point estimate, but it's within error bands or credible bands that are very, very wide. So I think the best interpretation of this graph is there's no statistically significant effect on US competitiveness. So tariffs, or we don't find evidence that in our sample that imposing tariffs helps to depreciate indirectly the US real exchange rate. So it doesn't make the US cheaper. There's just no significant effect. Let me say something very briefly. So these are 12 pictures in 60 seconds, so you can remember nothing. But let me just go to the top row and say what we do here. The top row is 8 quarters before Nixon and 8 quarters after Nixon. The vertical line is when Nixon in August announced the 10% surcharge. Then, I don't know if you can see it, there are 2 lines, a red line and a blue line. The red line, the dashed red line, is the counterfactual. What do we mean by counterfactual? We just take all the tariff shocks, transitory and permanent, 8 quarters in the entire window, we set them to 0. So that's our counterfactual. And if you look at those 4 graphs, I think your first best look is that even during large tariff increases, we already showed you that tariffs don't matter unconditionally with the variance decomposition. Here we're asking whether this big episode, which is clearly visible here, do they show up? And I think to a first approximation, the blue and the red line is the same. You can see some small differences. That is to say, absent the tariff shocks, inflation would not have fallen as much, right? Or absent the tariff shocks, the import to output ratio would not have fallen. This is easy to understand with theory. This little graph motivated one of the robustness analysis. Was it actually true that the price controls in the Nixon era made that graph not very useful to look at, because inflation, there were price controls, and so inflation was perhaps mismeasured. So one of our robustness analysis is to treat inflation for the duration of the Nixon price controls, which is August 1971 to April 1974, as latent, saying missing observations because they were mismeasured, and our results are absolutely robust to that. Okay, let me advertise maybe one other robustness result or 2 others. When we include the fixed weight tariff index, which controls for composition bias, or the TII, our results don't change. When we do endogenous import tariffs, in the sense that tariffs can respond with 1 period lag to macroeconomic aggregates, then our results are robust to that. I already talked about the Nixon price controls, and then this is not yet in the paper and maybe very unfair to our discussant. We have now one advantage of Martin's procedure is that you can actually very nicely estimate anticipated shocks at various horizons. And so we have done this now for between 1 and 8 or all of them at the same time. Anticipated tariff shocks, saying maybe what you're capturing is a little bit off because most tariffs are not surprises, most tariffs are anticipated, and we can show that our results are robust to this. Okay, so I already advertised the findings that we have. So the literature, the macro literature on this is really surprisingly thin, the empirical macro literature. What do we find? Are tariff increases inflationary? We cannot find evidence for that in our sample. Are they contractionary? No. Do they improve competitiveness? No. Do they improve the trade balance? Yes, consistent with theory. If transitory, no. If permanent. And are they an important source of business cycles? No. Okay, thank you.
All right, great, awesome. Thank you for the great presentation. And Daniel, can you share your screen?
So yeah, thank you very much, Steve, for the invitation. Let me start off by saying I really enjoyed reading the paper, and also admit that I had in the back of my mind an SFAR as well, but I didn't write it anywhere in the paper in my slides, so I'm safe, I think. Yeah, so let me just also say that the usual disclaimer applies since I'm at the Bank of England. Okay, so as Stephanie laid out, the motivation for this paper is essentially that there's very little empirical evidence on the macro effects of tariffs, and that's somewhat surprising considering all the micro and trade level research that has been done. So I think it's really refreshing to have some results here. And the evidence that does exist does not take into account the persistence of the tariffs, as Stephanie mentioned. And of course, in our standard dynamic optimizing models, this is a really important distinction to make. And that's because temporary tariffs affect intertemporal prices of consumption, whereas permanent ones do not. And that's a point that's made back by Svensson and Razin, 1983, and also this paper by Ostry. That's not me, by the way. Yeah, so I see it as a huge contribution to have a set of results to compare to macro models, and also to help distinguish between the strengths of different channels. You might think that intertemporal effects might be really important for transitory shocks, income effects really important for permanent shocks. And then you're balancing that against the intratemporal and supply side stuff. So it's really refreshing to have a set of results to compare to these models. So yeah. In terms of my discussion, I'm just going to kind of go through the results and offer a few thoughts that I had when reading the paper. This is, I think, one of the big contributions: permanent and transitory tariff shocks. This is what comes out of their architecture. Basically, the blue line here is essentially all the shocks, both the permanent and the transitory tariff shock, and then the red line is the permanent component. So the transitory shocks are essentially happening, in the big ones are in the 70s. You got the Nixon shock, the Ford shock, then you've got actually this reversal in between that shows up as sort of like a negative transitory shock. And then all throughout, you've got these little wobbles. So that's basically the transitory shocks. And the permanent shocks are a secular decline over the past 60 years. And then you've got Trump 1. And as Stephanie mentioned, Trump 2 would be maybe 12% on this chart. And given that Biden didn't undo the tariffs in the 2020 election, I would expect that, maybe the world should be anticipating that these will also be somewhat permanent tariffs this go around. Unless, maybe the Supreme Court does something. Okay, so here are the IRS that Stephanie showed you. And I found this word that I've been saying a lot now, refreshing. These are exactly consistent with what a textbook model might give you for a permanent tariff shock, assuming that monetary policy sort of looks through inflation to some extent and is able to stabilize output. So you've got no intertemporal change in prices, trade balance doesn't move. You've got that one-off increase in the price level, which gives you this sort of up and down inflation response, and monetary policy, potentially, is able to fully focus on stabilizing the output gap. I would probably have expected, a large negative demand effect from a permanent tariff. And so I would have expected monetary policy to ease. There's actually some evidence that there is some easing in the IRF of the Fed rate, but it's not super statistically significant. But in any case, they seem content to look through inflation and stabilize output. So that's really nice. It's also consistent, I would say, with the micro evidence. So I've got a couple of my favorite charts from papers that I've read in the micro literature. So on the left, you've got the Cavallo et al. Paper showing what happened to import prices at the various waves of the U.S.-China trade war. And you see like when U.S. Tariffs came into effect, you see these spikes in the import prices, which about match the level of the tariff. So that's like full pass through at the border. They find actually much smaller pass through to consumers. But actually, this go around, this is from a newer paper by Cavallo et al. They find, already starting at the 25% tariffs on Mexico, Canada, and the 10% tariffs on China for those fentanyl, that fentanyl excuse in March, you already see that prices at the store, this is like online retailers, start to go up for affected goods. That's the yellow line. And this happens progressively as well at each of the different tariff announcements this go around. It also seems to be true for domestic affected goods. That's that dark solid line. And that's two types of goods. That's one, goods that use as intermediate inputs, the tariffed goods, but also, substitutes, domestic substitutes for these tariff goods. So those are also increasing, although it's fallen off a little bit recently, and they're increasing relative to unaffected domestic goods. So that's exactly consistent with the story that the authors showed. This has sort of like a one-off, potentially, this is still early days, but it looks to have like a one-off increase in tariffs. If you view 2025 tariffs as like a permanent tariff shock, that's exactly what you might expect. So that's great. Here, I'm also plotting here like the net exports of the U.S. Over the past 30 years. This is in nominal terms, actually, so I could get things monthly. And the vertical lines are the various tariff announcements from both 2018, 2019, and 2025. And I mean, broadly speaking, there's like the least amount of action in the trade balance happening around these tariff episodes. So that's exactly consistent with the author's results. I would point out one interesting thing is there was clearly a lot of anticipation effects, tariff front running this go around, and that contributed to the output response in Q1 2025. For example, like there was, output fell in the U.S. And it was in large part driven by this tariff front running. But all in all, I see this as really confirming with different data the results from Stephanie and Martine's paper. Then the transitory effects of tariffs. So here on the trade balance front, this makes total sense and is exactly consistent with the textbook model. On the inflation side, okay, there's some demand-driven disinflation potentially. And that could be driven by both intertemporal effects, but also just like wealth effects, like income effects. Although I would have probably expected those to be larger for a permanent tariff than a transitory tariff. But then, as Stephanie pointed out, output improves. So I see the on-impact increase in output is exactly consistent with the increase in the trade balance, right? So that I think makes sense. But I'm more interested in this hump shape response. And I know Stephanie didn't want to go into it, but I still think it would be cool to know if this is, is this government spending? Like this, a lot of these transitory tariffs are happening in the 70s, Vietnam War is raging. Is that what's going on? Is it a story about investment, but real rates don't move that much? I mean, it could be that this is super productivity enhancing for domestic firms and they're investing in response? I don't know. Could tariff front running be playing a role? Could accumulation of inventory? So, for example, if they're not sure that the tariff is going to be transitory, but it could worsen, I could expect that I actually want to accumulate some inventories in the short term, and that could lead to a hump shape response. But seeing all the components, I think of output would be pretty useful. And finally, I wanted to talk about exchange rates. So this was the result that I found most puzzling at first, but then I began to think that there are some interesting explanations for it that could be explored further. So first off, unilateral tariffs have been shown to appreciate currencies pretty across different studies. I'm citing two here. But there are many reasons why this might not be the case in practice. So the first one is obviously if there's foreign retaliation. So I've got this new paper that talks about in the first Trump administration using like daily data when Trump was when the U.S. was putting tariffs unilaterally, that unambiguously appreciated the dollar. But when there was retaliation, you could actually get the dollar depreciating. And we talk about different asymmetries, dollar currency pricing, small share of imports for the U.S. in the consumption basket. Those sorts of asymmetries can explain that result. For China, when China puts tit for tat tariffs, actually the dollar is flat. So that got me thinking, on the permanent tariff front, most of the shocks are basically this secular decline in tariffs, and that corresponds to global trade liberalization, essentially. So if you were to put this into a model, you would basically be saying it's like retaliation, effectively. Both the U.S. and its trading partners are simultaneously reducing tariff barriers. So to what extent is the exchange rate response tied to this global liberalization, trade liberalization? And then also got me thinking, back to the IRFs themselves, one story is that it's because it's a permanent tariff that you don't see an effect on the trade balance and so forth. But another is that, is it because these secular decline in tariffs is happening simultaneously across countries? Another story could be low import substitution, which is definitely possible because it seems that on the authors find evidence of some large demand side effects, like intertemporal effects. So that's possible, especially on the transitory tariff front. I would also just bring up here that the fact that in response to a transitory tariff, there's such a large disinflationary effect, but there's little effect on the real exchange rate. If nominal is moving with real, then these effects are really large in the rest of the world, the disinflation, most likely. And so even if, maybe US tariffs are not an important part of the US business cycle, which I really buy, but maybe they have an effect on the rest of the world quite significantly. Another reason, that was quoted a lot for why the dollar fell in April is the reserve currency shock. So tariffs can often accompany those sorts of shocks. Well, not often, but actually in the sample that the authors use, there's also the Nixon shock, which really got me thinking, firstly, there is precedent for tariffs being associated with sort of reserve currency dynamics, which is quite cool and I think underexplored. But yeah, to what extent is the Nixon shock playing a role here? Closing the dollar, the gold window, depegging. As the authors point out, there's this large depreciation taking place alongside the tariffs. I know that the authors point out that for output inflation and so forth, the tariff is not the primary driver, but is the tariff driving, according to the model, the exchange rate response, for example, around Nixon? And finally, of course, how exchange rates behave are going to be intimately tied to how monetary policy responds. And the sample, covering 60 years also covers many different monetary regimes. You've got the gold standard, you've got not hyperinflation, but very high inflation in the US, no nominal anchor. Then you've got Volcker, then you've got great moderation and so forth, ZLB. So I guess absent a clear monetary policy framework. I guess and if monetary policy is sometimes responding one way, sometimes responding another way to these tariff shocks, I can see why exchanges would not move uniformly across different tariff episodes. And I wonder to what extent that might also be explaining some of the other results in the paper. The monetary policy response is not always precisely estimated. Okay, but yeah, overall, I really enjoyed reading the paper. I see it as a very big contribution to the empirical tariff literature, and finally allows us to map how tariffs play out in the data to model settings because they distinguish between permanent and transitory tariffs. It's a really important finding that tariffs are not an important part of the driver of the U.S. business cycle. But I think the results sort of start to hint that they might be important for other countries, U.S. trading partners, for example. And I'm still a little bit curious about what role retaliations, monetary policy regimes, and other shocks might be playing for the transitory response. But the permanent tariff results are really, really neat and exactly coincide with my priors. So yeah, thanks very much.
Okay, great. We are a little bit over time, but Stephanie, do you have any response to the discussion?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you very much, Daniel, for a really great discussion. There's a lot of things we can pick up from. I totally agree with you that we need to look into which component of absorption is moving, in response to the transitory shock. That's something definitely important. And then retaliation, Daniel is totally right. We don't have retaliation in there directly, right? The only defense I could mount against that would be to say, I have 10 shocks competing for the macroeconomy, and I don't really label them. And maybe, again, retaliation tariff shocks are overall too small that they don't get a kind. But if it was true that that's also not true in the data, there was an uncorrelated or there was another shock that could be a retaliation shock, that potentially, since I have a lot of shocks, I could pick it up. But then Daniel will probably come back to me and say retaliation shock is not at all uncorrelated to the tariff shock per se, so your model doesn't capture that. We were thinking initially, but given now what we find, that these anticipated shocks we estimate, which Daniel didn't see and we haven't shown yet, might capture some of the retaliation concerns, which I think are very real and something we need to address. And then let me just mention one other thing. We don't allow for a break in monetary policy. That's correct. We have, so we are thinking about how to address this. But and also, sorry, I am not. We will definitely look at your paper on retaliations. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
Cool. So we are out of time. So I would just conclude here. Thank you again for Stephanie for the great presentation, and Daniel for the great discussion. We will have our IMIM Rising Star series this weekend and the next weekend. So we will have a few job market candidate presenting topics on AI, international macro, and international finance. So I hope I will see you there in the next seminar series. Okay, thank you everyone. Bye.